Hi, you guys. So my name is Shadia Khan,
And my name is Aliyah L.
and we're going to talk about Chapter 10, which is bilingualism and multilingualism between diversity and globalization. And it's written by Richard Clement, Jessica Schulman, and Sarah Rubenfeld. And it just discusses just the overall idea of being bilingual or just nations that are bilingual and just some consequences, outcomes, things related and effects of being just bilingual. So I'll let Aaliyah start.
So to begin, we do have a definition that they gave in the textbook. The first one is the definition they used was by Merriam-Webster, and bilingualism is defined as the ability to speak two languages or the frequent use of two languages. And multilingual is containing, expressing in several languages or using or being able to use several languages. So the book goes on to say that the definition is just way too broad, way too simple, and it's deceiving for numerous reasons.
Yeah. So um, the definition that we read to you, it just states that there's two languages, but um, being bilingual or just bilingualism itself, it has different definitions for different circumstances. So the first thing that um, in the book it states that they have a problem with the definition is there's no clear distinction between individual bilingualism, which means like me, myself, and I, and like the languages I know or do not know and whatnot, and then just bilingualism overall, which is usually addressing a city or a nation that have multiple languages spoken in them. Um, so yeah, that's one of the first reasons.
And defining a community as bilingual can also raise a lot of questions. This was the second point that the book made as to why the definition was way too simple. There's roughly about 6,000 languages around the world, and a lot of languages are not distinct enough or sufficient enough to be deemed as a national language or a country to be called bilingual. Bilingual is dependent on political and social climate in which a group evolves. And then language must be recognized to be deemed legitimate and used legitimately. So that's another reason.
Yeah, and then another reason that they stated was just like the fluency in two languages, which is bilinguality. Excuse me if I said that wrong, but basically that's just the question that is asked: is how fluent must one be to be in a language in two or more languages to be considered bilingual. So an example of that would be I was born and raised here, so obviously I know English, but I also know Bangla and I also know Hindi. And so I can speak the two languages pretty fluently, I want to say, after observing and self analyzing, but I do not know how to read or write in either two of those languages. But I still do consider myself fluent enough to speak and understand someone when they're speaking Bangla or Hindi.
Right. And so for me, on the other hand, English is my first language, but I also grew up knowing learning English and Spanish. But I'm not like I can speak it, just not very fluently. But I would still consider myself bilingual in that language versus where I've gone to school and I've taken French for 3 years, and I still wouldn't even put that on a resume or anything. I wouldn't. I just yeah, I'm not so good in that.
Yeah. So some things that were discussed in the book and in this section was there was a couple of studies that were made, and in one of the studies, it shows that children from an early age can differentiate two languages, and that has to be done pretty much at an early age. As many people know, we try to teach kids certain things from early on, because they obtain that information more at a younger age than they would during their during their adult years. But it also does explain that if you were to require a child to fully learn two languages and really be fluent in those two languages, two languages that two or more languages that you would want to teach the child, you would have to give equal treatment to both languages. And what that basically means is, um, the parents would have to give equal priority to both the languages. They would have to be exposed to both languages equally, and just pretty much have both the languages be treated fairly. That's the only way that the child can obtain all that information and basically not be overpowered by one language rather than the other language.
Right. So they can both have equal opportunity to be successful in each language. And touching back onto that, so there's two different kinds of bilingualism. There's simultaneous bilingualism, is when you learn both languages at the same time growing up. And that brings the child at an advantage, like you said again, because it's easier for them to catch on and learn, and they're able to differentiate um, like the two different languages without having any disadvantages. Versus successive bilingualism is when the L2 is learned later on in life. So, yeah.
Yeah. And then another thing that should be noted, that you should be able to adaptively to the situations involving that second language that you learn. um, you should be comfortable with the second language that you learn and all the other factors that come with just that language, whether that's the culture, the community, all of that stuff. It shouldn't be an issue. So yeah, moving forward. So the next thing that they talk about, and it's something that is stated in the book, is that something to really look into is how majorities groups and minority groups, and or majorities and minority languages learning development is quite different from each other. So I don't know if Leah wants to touch. Do you want to?
Yes. So based on what the text says, it says that, or it was a study by Lambert. Um, it says that children who are minorities or anybody who's minority, once they get adapted to learning a second language, they have the tendency to lose track of their first language and the cultural aspects that come behind it. Versus majorities have more advantage when they learn an L2. They're able to keep their second language. It's easier for them because of their majority status. Um,
And then just to touch back on that, so basically minority groups that forget their first language when learning the second one is called subtractive bilingualism, and majority groups that learn a second language without forgetting their first language is additive bilingualism.
right, and so a good example that the textbook had was the English only movement, which is, I want to say, dominant and is happening now. It's also happened in the past, where it's made English the primary language in the States, even when there's an abundance of Hispanic communities in certain areas, it's still English only. So, despite the high population of the minorities, they have a weak institutional power, which causes this to happen.
Yeah, and institutional power is really spoken a lot about in this textbook because it has a lot of influence when it comes to like um, language and just being in bilingualism in a nation, because institutional power can overpower a certain minority group into forgetting or not speaking in their language. And that goes also to say that social status is also very discussed about and is a huge factor when dealing with bilingualism. So there's a lot of different aspects when it comes to learning a language in a or bilingualism in a nation. But yeah, so the next thing that we talk about is the relative status of the first and second language groups and the linguistic composition of the community that are the main determinants of the linguistic and cultural outcomes of a second language acquisition. And then they discuss about ethno-linguistic vitality, which is basically is the group's ability to maintain and protect the existence of their language and identity.
Right. So there was three dimensions of ethno-linguistic vitality, and the first one is the number of speakers composing that language group, as well as the distribution of the language in a certain territory. So them being able to, the amount of people, the more people they have speaking that language in a certain territory or in different communities means they have higher ethno-linguistic vitality. The second one was institutional control. So the control that the group has over its development politically, socially, and religiously has a huge impact on the language and the credibility of the language, really. And then the last one was the social status. So basically, the social status and the language social prestige puts it on
Yeah.
a higher pedestal depending on the social status of the language.
And then going back to just the definition itself, groups ability to maintain and protect the existence of their language and identity. So something to be aware of is there is a direct link between the communicative process and our individual identity. It is also, it's really sad to know this, but like if there's many instances where if there are people that who forget their first language, they'll start to lose their first cultural identity that is associated to that language. And I can give numerous amount of examples about this, just coming from being a minority myself. I see in my community South Asian kids, they're born or raised here, and they start to develop learning English, but they also within time start to lose their mother language, whatever that may be, Hindi, Bangla, Urdu, whatever it is. And because of that, they also start to lose the cultural aspects that come with the language. So you just kind of lose that cultural identity, and it kind of sucks because I know how culturally and how connected I am to my roots, but I also associate with this more westernized culture by living here in America. So I think that's very important.
Yeah, it is. Um, so the next section in the textbook talks about the social consequences and the cognitive consequences. Um, there was a study by Knowles and Clement, and they realized during the study of Knowles and Clement, they realized that the minority francophones showed um, how would I say it? They when they obtained their second language, they attained that, but they also lost the expense of their first language identity, which is goes back to what you were saying. Um,
Yeah, that's basically like what this section was saying is while there are positive outcomes from learning two or more languages, um,
there's
back in the day, there was some consequences where people would lose their first language and their first language identity when obtaining a second language. Like we nowadays, it's not as bad. We have bilingual programs, and high schools and colleges teach courses and whatnot. But like back then, they didn't have these kind of resources, and because they were so um, invested in learning a new language, it was at the cost of losing the first language. So that's basically a consequence of learning
social
two or more languages. Hmm.
And there was another study that got it in Clement examined. They examined a town in Canada where only 2% of the population are francophones because of exogamous marriages, meaning they married outside of their culture, outside of their predominant language. And it wasn't like that in the past, but over time it just shrank. Like to now where 39% of the people are identifying English as their first language. So it's kind of crazy to see the impact
Yeah.
over time in social settings.
Yeah, and it's interesting to note that while something to think about is that while a lot of language programs, these high school college courses or just any language program that teaches new languages, uh, they intend to promote diversity, it could be at the cost of backfiring on the minority groups that that the languages that you are learning. So the systematic relationship between the social conditions and the language laws therefore risk bringing results that are opposite to the intended goal of bilingualism programs. But there's some positives also, like we said, of being bilingual. It is known in the Peel and Lambert study, it shows that bilinguals actually score higher than monolinguals on verbal and nonverbal intelligence exams. Um, and that's just to elaborate, bilinguals can technically manipulate two symbolic systems, aka languages, and they can analyze them into more greater details. And then they have a greater meta-linguistic awareness and a cognitive flexibility. So a positive cognitive outcome of being bilingual, it will only is the fact that they have a higher advantage when it comes to intelligence exams, but these results will only occur if both languages are learned and valued at equal levels.
Right.
Yeah.
So going into the subject of attitudes, prejudice, and discrimination, there's a lot of backlash that goes into being bilingual and multilingual. Um, Fluency in another language emerges from positive intergroup contact, and it's presumed to entail positive intergroup climate. So if you don't have positivity around you and surrounding your cultural aspects of a certain language, it's not going to be quite successful. They were also talking about code switching um, in the chapter, which they define it as corresponds to an individual's tendency to alternate from one code to another during the same interaction or across multiple interactions. So, code being language, dialect, different styles of language, and then switching coincides with speech turns.
Yeah. And then code switching can happen in three different strategies, and we're going to just go, me and Aliyah are going to go back and forth about talking about the three different strategies. So the first strategy is called divergence, and that basically means it entails reverting to one's first language when the conversation has carried in the second language. So say if let's say there's two Hispanic women talking in Spanish, but then suddenly one of the women start talking in English. That's what divergence would mean. That's one of the strategies.
Right. And the next one is convergence, is when two people are talking and one person switches to the language of the interlocutor, which is the person who takes part in the conversation. And this is seen as a positive thing.
Yeah,
Is divergence, and then the next one is maintenance, which is also negative. This is no switching at all. It is seen as negative and hostile. I'm not quite sure why, but that's how the book states it.
yeah. Um, so those are the three different strategies, and it says that communications accommodation and they discussed that the communication accommodation theory states that the strategy is motivated by intergroup attitudes. So it just depends on how they their attitude is about a language in a conversation and how they feel about a certain language. If you have negative feelings toward a language or the background or the culture behind that language, you're gonna be more negative. And if you're more positive and open about it, then you'll behave more positively. But code switching is very important because it is motivated and conveys an individual's attitude towards another language group.
All right. So there was an example in the book that really caught my attention, and it was the Genesis and Boris study. So they originally studied a clerk and a client, and of course the clerk would converge to the client's language to accommodate. And I can really relate to that because at work, whenever I see somebody who is struggling and who asks me if I know or understand how to speak Spanish, I'll converge and accommodate to help them out.
I
So that's why it's seen more as a positive versus, yeah, versus any of the other options like diversions and maintenance.
Yeah. And then they discuss about the linguistic intergroup bias, and that's basically those who speak negatively on their own groups, or sorry, those who speak negatively about their own groups as well as out groups. There are some people that are just negative
Yeah.
about their own languages, and that's just kind of how it is. They're not as open-minded or appreciative about learning new languages as well as other languages that outer groups that or they're out they're not familiar with. So that's what linguistic intergroup bias is.
Um,
But
let's
yeah.
see. There were also given an example in the book to where they studied to see what it takes for somebody to be a mediator um, during cultural conflict. And they found that it was necessary, identification of one's own ethnic group was necessary for them to be a mediator. So they would have to have a strong first language identity in order for them to be a part of or intervene in any cultural conflict. Versus minorities, they may not involve themselves in situations like this because they are vulnerable of their own identity. So that was pretty interesting. It makes
So sorry, yeah, got it.
you're good. You're good.
Yeah. So the final section, and it was pretty a short section that was in the textbook, was just bilingualism in society itself. And basically, the book talked about four ideologies that are involved in society relating to bilingualism. The first being the pluralism ideology, excuse me. And basically, that ideology discusses how citizens should adapt to public values, including responsibility to learn other languages and protect it as well. They should also financially support social diversity and minorities. I agree with this ideology 100%. Just because I might not be accustomed or know a specific language, you should always, protect it, have a responsibility to learn. Knowing more languages helps you learn more things about people in the world, and it gives you more opportunities for yourself and in your life. It's honestly more beneficial to learn more languages.
It
So
helps you become more culturally diverse and understanding so you don't have these linguistic biases.
right. You should be more acknowledged about other languages as well as their cultures than be to be ignorant and just assume.
Close minded.
Yeah.
So with that being said, the second ideology was the civic ideology. It's more conservative. They do tolerate diversity, but it does not support development of minorities. So minorities would have to develop at their own costs.
Which I think it's kind of, like it's kind of done. There are a lot of people that follow this ideology,
I think
like
I
they'll
think it's going on in the USA for the most part.
yeah, because there are people that say that they support minorities and their development and for them to flourish, but there's not much done about it. No one, so everyone's quick to say, yeah, I'll come, I'll help you out and do whatever, but when it comes down to the nitty gritty, no one's there to really help.
And it also kind of relates to what's going on today with movements like Black Lives Matter movements. They're trying to bring attention to these different groups that need attention. So yeah, I'm gonna go to the next one again.
Yeah. And then the next ideology is the assimilation ideology, which basically states that minorities abandon their language in favor of the dominant group. And this is shown a lot in today's day and age. A lot of minorities might feel, like they don't feel comfortable sharing and speaking their language. There a lot of times you'll see the viral videos of women speaking in Spanish or Arabic or whatnot, or people. You'll see videos, these viral videos of people speaking their native language, and someone has an issue with it because, oh, you're talking about me, or oh, you're cursing me out, or blah blah blah. And these videos can get minority groups afraid or uncomfortable, so they're forced to give up their language just so they can fit in with what's known as the more dominant language in a certain community or area.
And the last ideology is the ethnicist ideology, which promotes assimilation and limits participation of minorities in society overall.
Yeah.
So this one is just it's not fair.
Yeah, definitely.
This is what
uh,
causes languages and different cultures to
Disappear.
eventually, yeah, disappear over time.
Yeah. So definitely assimilation ideology and ethnicist ideology is not clearly our favorites, but it is a thing. But we're gonna conclude our presentation by just going over just some basic things. We just wanted you guys to be aware that bilingualism doesn't just relate, when people think of the word bilingual and bilingualism, they just relate to, oh, you can speak two or more languages, but there's just more to that word. There's the definitions can be more complex. Just it's depending on the circumstances. And then we started discussing the differences with majority groups versus minority groups when dealing with bilingualism and multilingualism, and how completely different the two have to relate in back then versus now. There are both positive and negative outcomes to being multilingual or bilingual. Some being that, those who are bilingual and multilingual have an advantage when it comes to tests and whatnot. But then the negative outcome could be that those who learn a second language might lose not only the knowledge of their first language, but their own identity associated to that
Oh,
language.
yeah.
Yeah, and then lastly, there's multiple factors when it comes to looking into bilingualism. Factors such as institutional power, social status, communities, things like that have a big involvement when it comes to bilingualism, especially in nations, but as well as inner groups and outer groups. But yeah, that's just a little bit more about bilingualism and multilingualism, and we hope you enjoyed our presentation.
Yes. Thank you.
Thanks.